It's good to be with you all tonight and see some familiar faces and old family members that we miss dearly, but glad that they can be here with you. And unfamiliar faces as well. Certainly always really good to have an opportunity to get to be with other Christians, especially when we don't live very far from each other at all, but don't get to actually know each other. So it's good to be here with you. You should know that I am not a preacher, and I am an average Joe. So lower your expectations from the get-go, okay? I will like to conduct this as much as you're comfortable and willing to participate with as more of a Bible class tonight, maybe a little bit of a preachy Bible class. So we're going to kick it off with a little bit of participation that I welcome your input in, kind of before we really introduce what the topic is for tonight. So I want you to consider a couple of questions. What comes to your mind first when you think of the God of the Old Testament? Open it up to you. What? A lot of law to keep. Okay, sure. What else? Firm? I like that. Okay, yeah, absolutely. That's a thought we have. He's, right? What's that? Not perfect? Okay, that could be something that we would think. Sure. What else?
Direct.
Direct. Okay, absolutely.
Protective and caring.
Protective, absolutely. And then I heard loving and caring. It's nice to have an audience that already knows, what I think about the God of the Old Testament. Others? Any others? Absolutely. So he expects love from his people to him, right? Absolutely. Any others come to mind? Anything else?
He's a planner in planning. He's got it all mapped out.
Absolutely.
And even the evil one will straighten out the one that went astray.
Absolutely. I love that. Thank you so much. He is planned. He is executing that. It does not make sense to us along the way, but it is what he has planned. I'm going to ask it a little bit different way. What does the world typically think, or maybe our Christian friends in other walks, what's common to be thought of the character of the God of the Old Testament? Yeah, right. Unforgiving. Harsh. Absolutely. Mean, I heard. What else? Angry. Yeah, absolutely. Angry. Wrathful. Anything else?
Too many rules.
Too many rules. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There was more to come, right? God's character, I'm going to say, was perfect, but the law not fully brought to fruition or what it could be. And then, kind of conversely, what comes to mind first when you think of the God of the New Testament? Merciful, right? What else? Loving. Long-suffering, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Especially we come and we see the ultimate sacrifice of God bringing salvation through his Son. What else? Personal. Mm-hmm. Especially through that, quite literally personal. He becomes person, right? When we come to the New Testament, absolutely, and truly dwells with us. Yeah. What else?
He provided a way other than having to kill bullets.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. He provides a new way, right? One that we can participate in this way. And that's the same way again. What does the world typically think about the God of the New Testament in contrast to the Old?
Anything goes.
Sure. Yeah, anything goes. That kind of definition of love, right, and goodness is this: you're good. You're good. Like, don't worry about it. Absolutely. What else? Tolerant. Absolutely. That's a good way to put it. Very overtly tolerant. Yeah. What else? More passive. Yeah. So he's not smiting anybody down once we get past, like partway through Acts, right? Absolutely. Anything else?
The God of the New Testament brought salvation to the people.
Absolutely, yeah. So he brings the God of the New Testament, bringing salvation, and typically, probably, maybe even in ourselves, we, not just the outside world, we may not be thinking of the God of the Old Testament quite enough in terms of bringing salvation. What was that over here?
God would want me to be happy.
As we're talking about the world, God would want me to be happy. This kind of idea. This idea of God and having a character at one period of time and a different character of another period of time is very common around us. But I challenge you also tonight to think about if there are shreds of that in your heart. If there are shreds of that in my heart, do I think of God as different then from now? Think of his goodness as different then from now. Tonight, our discussion is around the topics of God's goodness, his compassion, his forgiveness, and his immutability. Now, I had to look that one up just to let you know. If you need to, it's just the unchanging nature of God. He's not immutable. And rather than just kind of go through a bunch of passages in the Bible that say how good he is and that say how compassionate he is or how forgiving he is and that he doesn't change, I thought it'd be good to study a section of Scripture that I'm really passionate about. And we'll get to that in a minute. And more just ask the question tonight and for ourselves, is God good? If you've ever, you may have been through times where you question if there is a God. I have certainly been through those times. But if you've already wrestled with that and then you come to a period of time in your life of great trial, your question might not be if there is a God. You might be convicted of that, but your question might be, I know that there's a God, but I'm really wondering if he is good. Is he truly good? I'll tell you personally, in my life, that was it was a harder question that I've wrestled with than, is there a God? That I've been more easily convicted of. But this question of, is he actually good? That's been a harder one for me. And this is what I want to study with you tonight has helped with that. Another question, is God truly compassionate? Another way we probably think about this or hear it often is, does God care? Does he actually care about us? And does God forgive? If a God can be so good, if he can be perfectly good, how can he live with people and things that are not good, such as we are? And because if he doesn't forgive, then I can't have a relationship with him. That's not going to be good. And then, does God change? We've already kind of touched on this. The idea in the world is truly that God has changed. And kind of in mainstream Christianity, in that, okay, you have this God then, but you then have Jesus getting in the way and saying, oh, no, like, I'm going to save you from how big, bad, and awful he is, as opposed to both of these aspects that we've been talking about, having been present in his character continuously all along. We're going to study a little bit about that tonight, about the goodness, compassion, forgiveness, and unchanging nature of God. If you have your Bibles, if you would turn to the book of Exodus. We're going to fly through Exodus tonight together, really bringing out some specific themes and instances. I call this a case study of the character of God in Exodus. Exodus is truly what I think we can consider as God showing Israel his goodness. The first time he has truly displayed his character to the world in this much more open way throughout history. We know that he's communicated with people through the patriarchs until this time, where he's going to try to have a relationship with all people and truly show them who he is. So let's do a quick overview, kind of just setting the scene for when we get to the book of Exodus. So we know that from the beginning, this God that we learn about has decided, number one, to create man in the first place. And I challenge you maybe to think about that. He didn't have to do that, right? God was sufficient in himself before having created us. Why would a God decide to create man? And the only answer we can really come up with in the scriptures is that he desired to have a relationship with us. He desired to, as he did in the garden soon after creation, walk with man, truly dwell with us. The idea of Emmanuel that we see in Jesus to come, it's what he wanted from the beginning, is to truly, he walks with Adam in the cool of the day. What an amazing thought, a God that actually wants to dwell with us. And the important thought, I think, that already even brings out the goodness of God. Nobody can say that that's something that would come from somebody whose character is not good, right? To want to create something, somebody, a being, and then actually dwell with it, even in a lower state and lower station that he is already able to inhabit. But then we see that sin separates man from God. God can no longer dwell with man because God is good and he cannot dwell among this sin. Yet still, even still, God seeks earnestly and strives after still being able to have connection with man, and sets plans in motion to still get that connection with man. Again, challenge you to think about, did God have to continue with the creation project after Adam and Eve sin? No. God is within his right at that point to scrap it completely. But he chooses not to. He chooses to still seek relationship with man. And we go on. You see, later on, this man Abraham comes along, and God makes a covenant with him. Maybe he's special to a degree, and I'm sure he is from the people around him. Maybe God just kind of picks him, right? Abraham's not perfect. Isaac certainly isn't. Jacob absolutely isn't perfect. But God goes out of his way to seek relationship with them and makes a covenant and a promise with them about what would come in their offspring, that he would have a greater relationship with and actually dwell with. God saves Israel, or Jacob and his family, in spite of their wickedness. I don't know if you read through that section, there is a lot of wickedness in Jacob's family. Israel does not look good. A lot of massacring of entire towns of people. You've got rape. You've got awful things going on. And God decides to save these people anyway by bringing them to Egypt and saving them from a famine when he didn't have to. He could scrap the project then. Israel now, when we get to the book of Exodus, has been in Egypt nearly 400 years. That's something I haven't thought about. In the way Exodus reads, we kind of hear, Joseph died and a new king arises that didn't know Joseph. We don't think about the fact that 300 years happened in between Joseph dying and a new king arising. But a new king arises, but it's actually been 400 years. The people of Israel have gone generation to generation to generation. Does anybody even know the name of an ancestor of yours that lived 400 years ago? I sure don't. Absolutely not. So you can think about how much has changed in that time. The people have grown so much, and we learn that, and we get little snippets of this information, but Israel largely does not know God at all. They don't know who he is. Largely, they are idolatrous. We find out in Joshua, Ezekiel, and Amos references to the fact that they kept idols all the way through the wilderness. Ones from Egypt, ones they made up on their own. And we don't read about that necessarily along the way, but they're idolatrous. They don't know God. They're crying out, but do they even know who they're crying out to? Certainly there's a remnant that knows about God, but even they do not know about God as Yahweh, as the God that he introduces himself as in the book of Exodus. So let's look at Exodus 1, verse 12 through 14 here. But this is after this new Pharaoh has come up, and he's dealt shrewdly with them. Verse 12, but the more they were oppressed, The more they multiplied and they spread abroad, and the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in brick and mortar and all kinds of work in the field. And all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Obviously, this is a physical condition, but I think it's important that retrospectively we recognize that this is a picture of us in sin. The pictures we see in the book of Exodus are pictures of deliverance from slavery that are perfect and beautiful pictures of our lives in sin. And then what God does for us. Then we get to kind of our story here, and the first thing that kind of jumps out as bits of God's goodness that he begins revealing. Let's read beginning in verse 15. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah. I'm going to pause right there real quick. Do you know how many women are even named in the book of Exodus? Not many. Not many people are named in general in Exodus other than in the genealogies except for your main characters. And these women are immortalized from the Torah on by name for what they did. Let's read on. When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God, so we know some did and knew who God was, and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and let the male children live? And by the way, do you think that their lives were in jeopardy right then? Absolutely. And they respond, he says, why have you done this and let the male children live? And the midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives come to them. I like that, kind of sounds a little humorous there. But listen to this. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Such a tender way to say that, you have these women that risked their lives. They could have all been killed for not doing what Pharaoh had asked them to do. But God does care. He takes note of them. He immortalizes them by name in the scriptures, and he blesses them with families. We go on and looking then as we work through chapter 2. By the way, we meet this character, Moses meets this character after he flees, that's known as the priest of Midian, who becomes his father-in-law. And that just makes us pause for a second and realize that God interacted with other nations other than just Israel. And Jethro or Ruel is not the only one. We learn about Melchizedek, but there are apparently others. We got this priest in Midian who is of the Most High God. And amazing, God has actually been caring about everyone and desiring that all, even from way back here in the land of Midian. But then let's look down and see what happens with the people of Israel and what God is going to do about it. Chapter 2, beginning in verse 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Again, this tender language about God. What actions are attributed to God here that you notice? He heard. First, he hears. He heard their groaning. Now, notice, it doesn't say even that they cried out for help to God, right? There's a nation that doesn't even know him. They cry out for help. They're groaning. It doesn't even say to God, but it says that he hears. Still, what else does he do? He remembers. He remembers his covenant with Abraham. He is not a God that's going to change or forget that covenant that has been made already about this people. And what else does he do? He saw them. It could have stopped before that last verse, right? when we are suffering and groaning in trials, what do we want? What could help? Most kind words, you see like Job's friends and what they're trying to do, and they only hurt. And if you've been through hard trials and really been hurting, the people that mean well, that especially if they haven't been through it, most of what they say is more hurtful than helpful, but their heart is in it. What you long for the most is to be seen, right? For somebody to show that they understand what you are actually going through and can actually see you in it. Rather than making comments that kind of show that they really don't know. But God sees, and more than that, it goes on to say, and God knew. You can feel the tender language and the compassion that God is feeling toward his people here. And then over the next number of chapters, we see Moses is commissioned to go and bring these people out. And then when Moses goes, I don't know if you've noticed, the whole period of time with the plagues, we typically think of that as being, wow, God is really harsh and doing some terrible things. What could God have done from the get-go to this evil king that murdered his babies? Wipe them out. But how many chances does he give Pharaoh? 10, really, even before the 10 plagues, we have multiple chances that he gives Pharaoh. The first thing he tells Moses to do is go to Pharaoh and say, Israel is my firstborn son. If you don't give me my firstborn son, I will take yours. And he refuses. He hardens his heart. Pharaoh doesn't want to be told what to do. But God still, he pleads, warns, gives sign after sign, but then ultimately brings deliverance in the Exodus. But what we're going to focus on a little bit more is beyond that. We even see the compassion and goodness of God, and as he's taken these people who are just beat down, slaves that are working around the clock every day without the supplies that they need, and he brings them out and he says, you know what, I'm not going to make these people have to experience war right after I've pulled them out. He doesn't take them by the Philistines. He's like, you know what, I'm going to take them over to the Red Sea. The Egyptians, God knows, are going to follow those people into the water, but God says, I'm not going to make these people have to see battle right now. I'm going to fight for them. And he destroys their pursuers in the Red Sea and saves them from having to see war at that time. In the initial time in the wilderness, we know that the people of God have a little bit of a hard time just trusting God already, but he provides in abundance, even in spite of their faithlessness and their grumbling. They've just seen God do the most amazing things that anybody would have seen God do in all of time to that point. And, a couple days later, they're like, well, they just brought us out here to starve. This God isn't feeding us, isn't going to help us, but he provides for them in abundance. And we get on to chapter 19. And God goes ahead and he gets the people to Mount Sinai, and he promises this special relationship with them. Let's read verses 4 down through 8. He says, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all people, for the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. So Moses came and called the elders and the people and set before them all these words that God had commanded them. All the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. And Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. You see, God is going to enter into this covenant, but you see what he's expecting of these people, and what he wanted them to become was a kingdom of priests. What ends up happening later if we fast forward? Is it a kingdom of priests that we end up with? No, it's a kingdom that has priests in it. not a kingdom of priests. Something must end up going wrong between this promise and what he is expecting them and what we actually end up with, which is only a small portion of this nation is actually going to be priests to God and actually have that kind of a relationship with him, and almost ends up looking more like they're having to protect the rest of Israel and be a buffer around even the tabernacle so the rest of Israel does not get consumed by this good God who cannot deal with their sin. And we carry on here and we see the 10 Commandments given. God goes ahead and he gives them this radically good, just, and merciful law. I don't know if you've seen, I had not always seen the law in this light, that this was something that was not known in that period of time. It is known and normal to us, a lot of the things that is done. And honestly, some of it seems regressive in a way to our current culture and that kind of thing, because there's provisions for slaves and no kind of slavery can fit in our minds. But in that day and time, so much of this is brand new to the world. This is a law that does not allow slavery like these people just experienced it. In fact, you can't even be a permanent slave. It's not even going to continue on. God's not going to let that happen. This law respects women. That's absolutely crazy in this period of time. Not common. It demands justice for wrongdoing and oppression. Not common in this period of time at all. If you are more powerful, you get to do what you want. It demands care for the sojourner, the widow, the fatherless. It reminds them again and again how they are to care for sojourners, those that are traveling, and reminds them frequently that that was you. You are going to treat these people well because that was you. You are going to treat the fatherless well. You are going to treat the widow well. It even demands fair treatment of the poor in court. Like, wow, this is, is this talking about the American judicial system? This is new, and God gives this beautiful and perfect, merciful law to them. But you notice, it's a whole lot more condensed version of the law than we end up seeing later. There's more of these greater concepts, yes, some specific laws that he gives them, but pretty much how they are going to have to live, the social justice they are going to have to abide by in order to have this relationship with them. And then in chapter 24, where just before that, God has promised them that he is going to go with them up in this conquest as he gives them the land of Canaan. But then God makes this covenant with Israel. In chapter 24, all the people of Israel then touch blood in the covenant. I don't know if you've really read through this really carefully and see kind of what happens, but he has all of the way through here, God has been telling Moses, keep these people back from the mountain or they are going to die if they get close enough to me. They are not in a condition where they can be in my presence. Set barriers, remind them over and over again. But then these sacrifices are made. These sacrifices are made, and these people agree to this covenant, this law, and then Moses gets these, what must have been giant vats of blood from these sacrifices, and he throws it on the people. They all touch blood in this covenant. And then this really beautiful thing gets to happen. If you look at chapter 24, verse 8, and I think this is just really exemplary of what the character of God is. And you see, Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, "Behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with these words." Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. This hasn't happened since the garden. And God has provided a way that, in some sense, I don't know exactly how, but these people could see God and eat and drink in his presence. And all that God did and put up with to get to this point, to be able to actually do this. And as a side note, man, what can we look forward to then? You know, this one of these little pictures that we see repeated again and again throughout the Old Testament, and then even in the New Testament, even as we partake of the Lord's Supper together, of the feast that we will have with God one day on the mountain of the Lord, just like these people had here. But there's a problem that's going to come. Before that, though, the tabernacle project is on. God is going to dwell with man. He gives them all of these instructions for how to make this tabernacle. No, there's not even any mention that only some people would get to go into it at this point. There's not a mention of some people being special priests here. But there's this tabernacle. The tabernacle's project is on. They're excited about it. God is going to go with the people. And then in chapter 31, we see this beautiful picture, especially for people who are coming out of slavery, where God gives them his Sabbath rest. We don't have time to get into it, but God, gives them the laws of the Sabbath and kind of says just how important that is to him, that he is going to give them rest just as he had after his labor. And it is not going to be like slavery. They are going to have this day of rest, but then everything goes wrong. Moses is up on the mountain for 40 days, going back up to receive the law. And the people forget. I mean, just not even, maybe it was up to 40 days before, maybe it wasn't even that long, maybe a month before, Aaron beheld the God of Israel, but then is willing to assist these people to make an idol and blasphemously call that idol Yahweh. But what could God do right now? Does he have to continue with this people? In fact, I'm going to say no, he doesn't. In fact, his first plan is to not to, if you will. His goodness and his justice demands that he not dwell with this people in their current state, right? He says that he tells Moses to get aside, to get out of here, because I'm going to French fry these people, and I'm going to raise up a new people after you. God can still be faithful to his promises, right? He's still going to provide offspring for Abraham and make them like the sand on the sea. But he doesn't. He listens to an intercessor. Let's look here in chapter 32 and verse 11. But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven. And all this land I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. The Lord is right to bring this disaster on the people. I think anybody could agree with that. But in his goodness, he is willing to listen to a perfect intercessor. That intercessor comes to him and appeals to him based on his character and his reputation of God, and saying, how will this look to the people around, and calls on him to remember his promises and stay by those. Again, like we mentioned, not that he wasn't going to keep those promises there. And then you look down at verse 31. Moses has gone down. He's seen the people committing these acts. And I don't know if you know this, there's some euphemisms used here. These people are likely committing sexual immorality on the foot of the mountain where there is fire and lightning in the very presence of God, committing sexual immorality before an idol. And the very same people, some of those very same people who just beheld the actual God of Israel. And Moses comes down and sees this. The Levites, he says, whoever's with me, right? Who knows just how much of the people were involved in this? But he says, whoever's with on the Lord's side, come to me. And it's all the Levites. And they come to him and he says, go through and kill your brothers and sisters that are engaged in this. And they go and do that. And that is why God selects them as the priests, the only ones who are at least willing to be repentant and change from what they had engaged in if they had engaged in it. And Moses intercedes again. Look at verse 31, so Moses returned to the Lord and said, alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves God of gold. But now, if you will, forgive their sin. But if not, please blot me out of the book that you have written. An intercessor that is willing to throw his lot in with the people comes to God and pleads based on God's character and who he is, and seeks to actually know who God is. And God relents of that disaster. He doesn't kill them, but he still says later on in 33 that he's not going to go up with them. He's going to send an angel with them. I can't go up with them or lest I consume them. And the people mourn. And Moses pretty much says, that's not good enough. We need your presence among us. And he works with God and talks to God. He intercedes again in verse 12. He pleads with God and intercedes, asks if he can find favor in his sight. And finally, I think the most key thing that Moses does is he asks to see the glory of God. He says, let me know your nature, essentially. Let me know who you are so I can figure out how to please you, which is something that we need to be doing. And God's response to him is that he would make his what pass before him. Moses says, show me your glory, your nature in this way. And his response is, my glory that I'm going to show you is I'm going to make my goodness pass before you. So that's why we call this, the book where God shows Israel his goodness. And so he does that. He makes his goodness pass before him and proclaims to him his name. Let's see what that actually looks like here. Chapter 34, verse 5 through 9. God descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord, or Yahweh. Yahweh passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, or Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. And then Moses, after hearing the character of God, then he can appeal on the character of God, knowing who he is. He says, Moses quickly bowed his head to the earth and worshipped, and he said, if now I have found favor in your sight, O Lord, please let the Lord go in the midst of us. For it is a stiff-necked people, and pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for your inheritance. He heard now the character of God, in that he is a God that forgives iniquity, and so Moses asked for that specifically. He says, pardon our iniquity, forgive us of our sin, and take us for your inheritance. And God didn't have to do this. God doesn't have to go up with them. He can still fulfill his promises to Abraham and not physically go up with them, but he's going to provide a way now to where the people can actually still dwell with them. And then we see the rest of this, and then on into the book of Leviticus. These are all, in my view, all the provisions that God then makes to still be able to dwell with this people that just committed idolatry right in front of his face after ratifying this covenant with him. But I think this, we ask, okay, what does the goodness of God look like? It looks like this. This is how God defines his own goodness. A God that is merciful and gracious, that is slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. That faithfulness seen in him being faithful to the promises that he had made. That forgives iniquity and transgression and sin. But what about this? piece of it. And you might think, and when I read it at first, I kind of struggle with this piece of it, but will by no means clear the guilty. He says he's forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but will by no means clear the guilty. How does that reconcile? We'll talk about it next week. There you go. Yeah, and we're going to I think you guys are talking about the wrath of God next week, right? But is it not integral to the character of a God who is good to bring judgment? Is it a good God that does not free people from oppression? What was the deliverance of Israel from the perspective of the Egyptians? Judgment. There is no such thing as deliverance for somebody without judgment of somebody or something else. And we can kind of even think about this even as we go forward into, the character of Jesus, which has been so kind of marred in the view around us. But you remember, who did even Jesus say when he was prophesying about the destruction of Jerusalem? Who did he say was going to come in the clouds? The Son of Man. Jesus himself calling himself this war general that is going to come in destruction and judgment on these people. And we talk about it first. I thought of this kind of this lesson is like, okay, why are we talking about the goodness and the unchanging nature of God? But I think that's kind of they're integral. We have to talk about them together because ultimately we see this God here, and it's the exact same God that we see in Jesus, just so much more magnified, brought to full fruition in Jesus. We move in, we kind of come back to our question after looking at what God does and how he treats the people of Israel, and ask the question again, is God good? We have seen how he, when he didn't have to, comes down and cares for these people who are enslaved, how he brings deliverance to them even when he doesn't have to. He doesn't leave us. He doesn't abandon the creation project even from the beginning and just let us try to figure it out. Let Satan rule over this and start again with something else, or just annihilate it and move on. God rather sticks with us no matter what. Is God compassionate? Remember the expressive and tender words that God used about his people. God heard, remembered, saw, and knew. God cared even about these lowly Hebrew midwives who would still follow him. Does God forgive? I think any of us can be, and I know I have been, in just the depths with our own sin, and just like, how can I do anything right? God forgave the people who were committing sexual immorality right in front of him, days after they ratified a covenant with him, in his very presence, and he forgave them. He forgave Paul, who was dragging off his people to be murdered. He can forgive you, and he can forgive me, and he does. And does God change? Remember seeing the character of God and the whole nature of it. When we truly read the Old Testament and we see these acts where God does break out and exact his righteous judgment on people, are actually the very few and far between, right? How long is Israel in Canaan sacrificing their babies just like the Canaanites had before them, before he finally brings judgment? Hundreds of years of patience with them before he finally must bring judgment. And even in that, provides the way of escape for his remnant, is going to be just and righteous to those who do believe in him. Romans 11:22 says, "Behold the goodness and severity of God." There is no goodness without the severity. They are all together in God's goodness, and he truly has not changed. A couple of reflections I think that we can ask ourselves as we go forward today, and we'll finish. The first is, do I have the right view of who God is and was? Or do I allow a little bit of the world's view of kind of this dual nature of God, that he hasn't always been who he is now? And do I have the right view of his forgiveness and what it is based on? And this story is forgiveness of the people, not based on those people's merit. They didn't have an ounce of merit. But rather that forgiveness that he gave them was based on his character and the character of the intercessor. And who is our intercessor? One that is much better than Moses. And that is the character that his forgiveness of us is based on. Do I have the right view of God's heart of compassion toward me? Do I remember when I am low and when I feel so far away from him that he hears, he sees, he remembers, and he knows? Do I truly believe in the goodness of God? And I think a question that struck me in my heart in studying this is that if I'm unwilling to share with others about my God, do I really believe he's good? What else in our lives that is, I can't stop sharing about this new Chinese restaurant in downtown Chattanooga. Ask me for what it is, I'll tell you. But am I sharing the good news of God? Am I sharing that with others? And if I'm not, do I truly believe in my heart that he is good? Am I displaying the goodness, compassion, and forgiveness of my unchanging God? As we draw this to a close tonight, I just want to ask you, just like those people in crowded around the mountain there, as after those sacrifices when they were making this covenant, have you touched that blood? Have you touched the blood in the covenant with Jesus that he offers us now? Jesus' blood that we can in baptism? Or are you in the state that very quickly after you've touched that blood, or maybe long after, whatever it is, that you have become in a situation where you aren't right with God? Whatever is the case, we've seen even way back when with the big bad judgment God, that even when we could see more of those pieces of his character, he was nothing but forgiving to any and all who had a heart that would come to him in repentance. And if you're subject to that invitation anyway, you can come forward as we stand and sing.